All right, welcome back. And here we are picking up in another episode of talking about sort of philosophical pillars, philosophical questions, I guess. We've talked about epistemology. How do we know things? What are the roots and foundations of how we build knowledge? We talked about cosmology, about how we view creation, how we view the world, whether it is created or whether it is the product of random events through history. Along with that, another aspect of that we're going to be talking about today is ontology. That's not a word that most people have in their standard vocabulary. So why don't we start out, Caleb, by just talking about what is ontology? What is it looking at?
Sure thing. Ontology is talking about the nature of being. From ontos in Greek is being, and ology, right, come from logos, or the study of. So it's the study of being. And most people are introduced, I think, to ontology in terms of what's called the ontological argument for God. So if God, by his definition, if we're going to use the term God, that definition is going to be defined as the greatest being that can ever exist. So you're talking with an atheist, and he's starting to talk about God, but then he said, well, God can't do something. Well, no, that's not the right definition, because that's not the ontological reality of who God is, because he is the greatest that can exist. And so the ontological argument follows and says, well, if God is the greatest being that can exist, then existence, or can be conceived, is the greatest being that can be conceived, is that then to exist is better than not to exist. So if we can conceive of a God that doesn't exist and a God that does exist, the one that does exist is going to be greater, and therefore, by definition, ontologically necessary. And so God necessarily exists by his definition. Now, a lot of atheists and even agnostics do not like the ontological argument because it's very neat and they think it's sophistry or word trickery. But really what we're doing is saying we're trying to define the reality of who God is in his being. And we're trying to be consistent with that. Because if people talk about God and then put limitations on him, that's not really who we're talking about. And it's very similar if we're talking about a chair or a chocolate chip cookie, a car or a piece of cake. We understand there's an essence of its reality. And that if I say car, we're not talking about an animal out in a pasture that gives milk. That's not what cars do. That's not part of it being. And so oftentimes we'll take ontology as being just for granted because we're like, it's just obvious. We know what things are and what they're constituted of. But as we've been looking back in terms of the foundations of the problems with modernism in particular, there's a lot of debate about ontology, about who we are. Because if we remember, we started with epistemology. I think, therefore I am. All right. Well, where am I? Cosmology. Who am I? Ontology. Where am I going? Teleology. Just because somebody can start with a Cartesian foundation from Descartes that, we can start to reason based upon our self-awareness, that doesn't solve the problems of where we are or who we are or where we're going. So I hope that little snippet is helpful. What do you think about ontology, or what comes to your mind, Stephen?
Yeah, well, like a lot of these terms, there's overlapping in a lot of what we're going to be talking about with really all of the categories that we're discussing. But with ontology, I mean, the importance of it, whether we're talking about God, who defines himself in that sort of ontological way that you mentioned. He simply says, I am, I exist. And so that's important, like to wrestle with that concept. But also other things you talked about, these, what makes a thing that thing, right? What makes a car a car? And to get more into places that are of greater importance, what makes art art? Like, this is a question that we have wrestled with for quite some time, especially in modernist and postmodernist frameworks. What do we do when somebody makes something and everybody's saying that's not art, and he says, but I say it is? And then how do we say, on what basis do we say, no, that's not art? And we've kind of generally fallen back, sort of like Supreme Court rulings. You know it when you see it. Yes, but this is not necessarily a helpful rubric to use. I would say even more critically, this is at the heart of the discussion about abortion. Is what makes a human, right? What makes that life important? What makes it life? And so at what point do you begin to exist as a human being? Mm-hmm. And people will root that in all sorts of different places, in various inconsistent places, right? And that's where the argument is: what makes a person a person? Yeah. And that's an important question. Yeah. What is it definitionally? And as Christians, we ought to be the best, or we ought to be the most capable of making the case for what makes us people, what makes us important and distinct from animals, for instance. And that's really the one of the main difficulties, is you're seeing that comparison made cosmologically and ontologically. Is, are we just another species of animal, or is there something distinct? We root that in, we're made in the image of God, or at least we ought to root that in that ontology. But a lot of people are going to, because they have a different cosmology, they're going to root that in other realities.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of consequence. As we talked about in a previous episode on identity, ontology leads directly into identity. And identity is super important, right, in our cultural moment, to discuss where do we get our identity, what does it do, what are our responsibilities. And I don't want to go rehash all that episode, but there's a lot of importance, and not just with arguments medically or in terms of the value of life, but also how do we orient our communities, how do we orient work and jobs. As we talk about kind of the history, focus on the ontological aspect within modernism, I think some of these applications will become quite evident. So to kind of kick the ball off in terms of the historical thing, once again, like, ontology was not forefronted in, and as Stephen mentioned, ontology oftentimes gets like sidestepped a lot. Even in the most recent Supreme Court justice, process, it's like, well, what is a woman? I'm not a biologist. I can't tell you on that. Everyone knows, it's evident, right? And so this kind of like special pleading, or kind of almost begging the question, our arguments kind of come up oftentimes because people don't want to go through the discomfort of breaking down ontology. And why? I think part of the reason why ontology historically has been so uncomfortable for people to talk about is because we have to confront harsh realities. So very quickly, if we look at the materialistic cosmology that we talked about in the last conversation, and we jettison that forth and talk about ontology, well, what does that mean? It means that you are nothing more than a bag of flesh and a bunch of atoms arranged in a particular order. You are nothing more than just material. And so I have here a can of LaCroix water. Fundamentally, according to the cosmological materialistic view, I'm no different than this. I'm no different than the computer or the microphone or this desk that I have. We're all just matter. We have no inherent thing. I'm just more conscious or conscientious form of matter than maybe other forms of matter. And it doesn't really matter in a lot of ways because there's no meaning involved. And we did a whole episode earlier where we had a conversation about the meaning crisis. And it's not an accident that cosmology leads to a materialistic cosmology leads to a materialistic ontology. But no one wants to start with that because that's kind of a buzzkill, right? To start off and be like, let me tell you about your ontology. You're nothing more than a bunch of molecules smashing into each other. There's no such thing as love. There's no such thing as freedom. There's no such thing as anything because it's just a bunch of randomly ordered matter. Like, no one wants to describe that, right? So ontology oftentimes gets hidden and smuggled in. It's one of the pillars of philosophy and worldviews that is very revelatory, because it's going to get down to who people think they are and who they think you are. And spoiler warning, if you're nothing more than a bag of flesh, and then people can manipulate you, mistreat you, they can manipulate you and use you just like they would a piece of wood or a stalk of corn or fill in the blank, because ultimately there's no real difference between the two. And so that's very uncomfortable. And I think people, this kind of recognized or visual case, right? That doesn't pass the smell test when it's like, oh, ontologically, I'm just the same as a bunch of rocks or a bunch of wood. No, that's not right. We know that's not right fundamentally. And so no one wants to speak about that. So it's easier to leave that kind of just being hidden. But my argument here is, if we sometimes front load ontology and examine it, we'll save ourselves a lot of time, because people can make a lot of really interesting trickery arguments through epistemology and cosmology. But ontology reveals who they really are, pun intended. So what do you think about that, Stephen?
Yeah. I think as we ask the questions about this and begin to, a lot of it is about willingness to contemplate more specific answers to questions than we are comfortable contemplating. We were having a conversation, Caleb and I, earlier about things that are obvious. They are things that have been considered obvious, but one of the reasons why I think we are struggling with ontology in our current moment, which I think we are, I think ontology is a big problem. And it's because we have taken for granted the obviousness of ontology, right? That of who human beings are, of who men are, who women are. These were categories that maybe we took for granted about the nature of being a woman, the nature of being a man, but weren't able to articulate it. And so as it came under philosophical assault, we didn't have well articulated responses to those assaults. So I think about, if you're familiar with Matt Walsh and his documentary, What is a Woman? I think that was the name of his documentary. Yeah. When you watch that, there's obviously a lot of entertainment, gotcha moments throughout, and you're watching people fumble around with that question of what is a woman, like the Supreme Court justice. But at the end of the day, his definition of an adult human female is lacking, I think, in its full ontology. Now, it's helpful. I would prefer somebody to at least give that baseline definition, but that doesn't really get down to the greater depths that are needing to be addressed. What does it mean to be a woman? And is it merely chromosomes? Is it merely a biological truth, or is there a spiritual reality to that? And I think that's part of the ontological difficulty, is that people have thrown out spiritual elements. And so we're only left with sort of a material consideration. So someone is a woman because of the biology, because they have these chromosomes. But there are spiritual realities about femininity, about womanhood, that God created a category of being when he created woman. He didn't just create a physical thing, but he created a truth. He created a reality that can be described distinct from an individual woman. And this kind of gets into some philosophical underpinnings of a conversation that happens between Plato and later Aristotle, that Plato believes everything that exists physically has a form, a spiritual form, an idea of that thing. And then Aristotle kind of comes along and pushes back with a more materialistic note. Things only exist in reality. And so the ideas flow from the physical reality, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Whereas Plato says the physical realities flow from the idea, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the truth that there's truth to both sides of that observation that have to be taken into consideration. But for us, we need to recognize that humanness flows out of God's mind, right? That God has an idea about humans, and we are the product of that idea. So as we're making observations about what it means to be human, what we're ultimately describing is something that was in the mind of God before humans ever existed.
Yep. Amen. And I think part of the challenge, especially in our present moment, of the separation, and we mentioned a little bit of this in the identity discussion we had in previous episodes, is that we live in a time where people are all interacting digitally. You can present yourself online in many different forms. And so people are like, well, why do we have to be beholden to material realities? And you see this fracturing. And there was an irony, a big irony that I experienced, because growing up and then hitting the early 2000s, the like hardcore materialistic atheists were very, very popular and pushing against traditional Christianity. And there were a lot of people who fell away into atheism or agnosticism. But then what happened once the kind of digital revolution started kicking in the later 2000s, and people could start adopting different avatars and personas and started getting on video games and online chat rooms and all this kind of thing, then they realized, wait a second, I can project myself very different. And then what happened? There was an untethering from this reality that took place. And the entire materialistic, atheistic approach just crumbled. It was overtaken by a very disembodied social constructionism form of what they call wokeism today, or just kind of like high post-modernity. And in that, I remember listening to an interview with Brett Weinstein, who back then, and probably still very much so today, is kind of an avowed modernistic, materialistic, was an atheist. I don't know if he still identifies that as that or not, but he made the observation. He said, when people experienced online projections of different identities than what they had to materially inhabit, it fractured something deep. And in that fracturing, it broke our view of ontology, because the materialistic form of ontology only really works if you're bound by that material reality. But the internet and the digital space unlocked something different. And Brett Weinstein, his theory was the rise of transgenderism, the rise of adopting other identities, whether it's even as extreme as adopting an animal identity or something like that, rose to prominence because of that digital fracturing, or what we'd say fragmentation that took place. But the materialistic view was not just something that took place in the late 1900s. It had been propagated and cultivated for hundreds of years, all the way starting back with the nominalists, who are the outgrowth of the Aristotelian thought, as Stephen was talking about, the idea that it's just the material reality that's there, that's all that exists, and we shouldn't think of any ideals or things existing beyond really what we can see in a form. And modernism, really, as we've been talking about it, post-Cartesian modernism from Descartes onward, didn't have any problem with that, wanted that, and proposed a materialistic cosmology, especially with men like David Hume, that would then deny the existence of God, but then bring us into this materialistic ontology as well, where we're just a bunch of atoms and that's it. And none of those guys, because they were all incubated, right, in a Christian society that had concepts, real concepts also of ontology, of, well, we just know what a cow is, and we know what a dog is, and we know what a human is. They didn't have to struggle with that. And so Hume, his environment was extremely different than a Brett Weinstein's environment in 2020 or 2025, right? And so I think there's a lot of ways that those early founders in modernism, they were able to have those kind of like idealistic, ironically idealistic views of materialism, only because they lived in the time in which they did, and there wasn't that as much of a challenge there because of the prevailing traditional view of ontology that they could then push against. I hope that's making sense. What do you think on that, Stephen?
Yeah, that idea, as you say, the struggle with ontology comes from the struggle with cosmology, right? It comes from thinking that everything has arrived here by chance. It's a very, as you say, materialistic. We are looking at things as if they've all happened by accident, and then we are making observations on that basis. But with a creational cosmology comes a creational ontology, that what exists because of God, and therefore exists because of the mind of God, and so that they are rooted in purpose and definition that lies outside of their existence.
Amen.
That's a hard concept, and it's one that I think people haven't always had to wrestle with, because there was just sort of that more universal acceptance of a creational cosmology and therefore creational ontology. But we don't have that, right? And I think as you read through the Bible, one of the things that should affect you is the way that the biblical writers look, for instance, at ontological realities in creation. So the way they talk about animals and plants as if they have characteristics, right? That, this animal is this way. Mm-hmm. We don't think about animals like that, right? We don't think, we do some, but maybe just not as universally, that we don't think of ostriches as foolish. And yet that's the way that they are described in the book of Job, that this is a characteristic reality of ostriches, is that they are foolish. And so I think that's a part of their makeup, right? I think one of the things God is saying is, I made them that way. I produced them to be this way. And so we're looking at it just the same as men and women. We're looking at it, our current culture at least is looking at it as if we're downstream of random processes that have ended us up in biologically distinct categories, as opposed to created both biological and spiritual categories that says we're this way, not because of evolutionary processes, but that we are, with these distinctions are baked in, that when God created woman and God created man, he created us in certain ways. So as we see the patterns in various cultures who both believe in God and do not believe in God, what you will see is a consistency of patterned behavior that is in keeping with what God had in mind when he created men and women, that it keeps playing out over and over. No matter what social experiments happen, those patterns keep showing up over and over and over, because God created us with, spiritually, biologically true things about us.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And there's a consistency to that ontology of the Christian or the traditional creational ontology versus a more evolutionist or evolutionary materialistic ontology is going to say, well, we're always changing. We were once just amoebas, and then we were, monkeys or whatever, and then
that we can take control of the change, right? It's not just we are changing, but we actually,
that's the hubris.
Yes, can grab hold and make the changes.
Yeah, that's the arrogance, is because we've gotten to the point where we can manipulate material, and then we can kind of take charge of material reality. It's like, well, if that's just us, if that's our ontology, then we can shape our material view. And this was very, very popular in the 20th century, whether it's eugenics that started and like, well, we can just selectively breed people to produce this evolutionary superior line. That's how we're going to lay hold of it. That was quickly, I wouldn't say quickly, but it was jettisoned, right? Especially after World War II, recognizing the barbarism and just evil that is produced from that line of thought.
The overt versions were jettisoned.
Yes, excellent point. It is still practiced, but in more subtle ways and in darker corners of our society. But the overall view of it was kind of rejected. But what took place in the 1960s and really was popular, and we've mentioned Carl Sagan various times, talking about how we're made of stardust and stuff like that. I really think the Saganites, if I could call them such, really in the latter part of the 20th century, had this view of like, if we get more knowledge, if we get more scientific understanding, we are going to evolve, in essence, into higher order beings. We'll evolve the perfect government. We'll evolve the perfect forms of controlling that was kind of like the idea is like, oh, we're going to progress to be these like superhumans and super beings. And whether that was a manipulation of the food sources, of government forms, or whatever the case may be, human arrogance really came out. And it was not, we have a delivered ontology that is given to us. Now we are masters of our own fate, and we are going to continually progress, and we are going to get better. And it's just so interesting to go back and hear even the politicians, professors, and others in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this inherent concept of ontology, as we talked about. The modernistic cosmology is materialistic mostly, but also one that has inherent progression. We'll talk more about that with teleology. But it's also with this idea of ontology. We will be better versions. We just need to unlock this key. And one time I was listening to Ross Perot, and he was talking about the problems of education and the problems of poverty and all these issues in our country. And it's like, if we can just get the internet to everybody, then these things will get the knowledge we need, and the knowledge will help save us. And it was just like 20th century Gnosticism, like knowledge was going to save it. Well, now everyone has a smartphone, and have we progressed? No, we have not. So it's very clear that that little experiment was a failure. But interestingly enough, they took ontology for granted, or had this kind of like very idealistic, utopic vision of a materialistic ontology. But then what we have today is a completely fractured ontology that we don't even have that.
Yeah.
And as I was getting into college and seeing the dissolving of the materialistic efforts of atheism as in the early kind of forms of wokeism, very, very, very early forms where like postmodernism was the rage, and everyone was talking about Derrida and Foucault and all these guys, right, about breaking these things down. I started to realize, oh, whoa, hang on a second. Some of these materialist modernist guys are now on the side of Christianity. And why? Because they didn't want everyone just being completely untethered and identifying as a furry, or a man identifying as a woman. They wanted biological realities. And they're like, wait a second. If we go down this road and people completely break away from even materiality in terms of their ontology, we have nothing. And so it was shocking to me that so many of these like hardcore, and it's still today, you'll still hear a few of these guys in corners of YouTube and the internet who are like these old school materialistic atheists. And it almost sounds like they're like conservative Christians from some of the ways that they're talking, is because they're trying to get back to that point, because they realize ontology, epistemology has been completely fractured and they cannot exist. And it goes back to my point on David Hume. David Hume and the materialistic rise of cosmology and ontology was only really possible in an incubated form of the creative Christian ontology. But then when you take that away, who's to say that you're not a dog? Who's to say that you're not a woman? Who's to say that you can't just define your ontology? And this is where the materialists, atheists, in my opinion, are very dishonest. They had the hubris to act like they could control their destiny of ontology. But then when people actually went and did it on an individual level, they're like, oh, no, you can't do that.
Yeah,
so what do you think about that?
I think one of the things that has caused the breakdown again is it's this view that this separates existence from God. It makes it material. But then what also happens is, as we find, you can have a category, and then something that exists in a way that is at the margins at best of that category. We have thought we've used that, or culture has used that to break down that category. Let me explain what I mean. So, for instance, I remember years ago when the debate around gay marriage was occurring. And this was early days, right? The country was still very much in polling and stuff was against gay marriage, but I think we're articulating well. And I remember Alan Keyes, who's kind of a quirky guy that was running for president, but his argument, I've gone back and watched it. His argument was that marriage categorically must be able to produce children. And the argument back to that was, so what you're saying is people who get married, a man and a woman who get married, who for whatever reason, infertility, are not able to have children, they're not really married. And he said, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they categorically could produce children, even though specifically they may not be able to do that. They still meet the category that would be able to produce children. Whereas homosexuality categorically cannot engage in this activity. Mm-hmm. That's an ontological, teleological as well, but ontological, right? That the existence of marriage is rooted in this reality. And so this thing can't be marriage because it cannot possess this quality. I think that as we start talking about personhood, about what a person is, what a person ought to be, man, woman, yes, you may have people that exist that have their exceptions to those rules, that they don't fall into the category of humanness, whether it's sentience, whether it's self-awareness. You have people because of abnormalities and so forth may not have as much self-awareness as somebody else. It doesn't mean they're less human. But the category of human does include these realities, even though you have people that inhabit the margins or the exceptions to those realities, that they as a category still inhabit that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the idea of what is the being, what is the essence of this, and that's why it's ontologically important on that. And so ontology, as Stephen's pointed out, is not just in terms of the individual, right? It's also in terms of marriage or a church or a government. Ontology exists up and down the ladder. And so going back a little bit, we talked about the materialism aspect, which flows out obviously of the cosmology. But I kind of want to take some steps back and look at some, especially in terms of human nature, maybe, if it's okay if we go this route. We can come back to other routes if we want to. But Stephen and I have talked about a man named Jacques Rousseau. And I think his first name is Jacques, if I remember right.
Jean-Jacques.
Jean-Jacques. Okay, both names. There it is. Thank you. He was a famous philosopher, French philosopher in the 1700s. And he really was pushing back against other writers that preceded him, or even contemporaries. A lot of the foundations of modernism really got started in the late 1600s and early 1700s. 1700s, we mentioned David Hume. He was a contemporary of that time period. Even Adam Smith, kind of the founder of modern economics, or the father of modern economics, same time period. A lot of those guys really in the 1700s were making foundational and radical shifts away from things. But there were two guys really that had really different views on human nature, or human ontology. And one was Rousseau, who he had this kind of view that humans are inherently good. It's these systems that get us all in a mess, like government. And so he had the idea, like, if we could all just go back to being natives and living naked in the woods and just sharing with one another, then there would be no evil or no harm, no robbery. Everything would be great. So the idea of the noble savage, that trope, or like the wholly indigenous ones, like that goes back to Rousseau. But Rousseau was really pushing against other guys who viewed, like Jean Locke, who were looking at humans as just totally depraved, that they're evil, they need to be governed, man does no good, right? And Locke wouldn't say that necessarily, but Calvinism, that was started, prior to really the modernist movement, we're looking, in the 1500s, 1600s, with the Reformation, that there were those thoughts that, from a more theological perspective, that was an outgrowth of Augustinianism, right? Which Augustine, all the way back in early foundations of the Catholic Church, was debating a man named Pelagius. Pelagius was kind of more Rousseauian, taught people were more inherently good in their nature, their ontology, and Augustine, no, not so much. Well, Calvin and others took this to its extreme and said, no, humans receive a total hereditary depravity, meaning there's nothing good that we can do at all. And there was a certain line within modernism that took that kind of line and said, you're right, people are just evil. Now, some people didn't take it necessarily from a theological standpoint of like, oh, we're sinners. More of man is matter. You can even take it from a humanist standpoint. Just say man is matter and is chaotic in nature. And so the chaos or sin must be governed and controlled. So there are really kind of two major views and camps of the traditional kind of man is evil, and then the Rousseauian view of like man is good. And those had different approaches. And I would argue that modernism, we're going to eventually get to postmodernism. Modernism, I think, took more of the man is evil in his ontology and needs to be governed, needs to be controlled. Now, whether that did that from theological standpoints or from more of a materialistic standpoint, it depends on the philosopher. But the end of it, it was kind of, in terms of ontology, was a united front that people were bad and they needed to be controlled. Now, the Rousseauians, they'll have their time in the spotlight, but that's going to be later on. They have it a little bit with the transcendentalist, in the romantics, but not all of the transcendentalists or romantics were necessarily Rousseauian or like people were good in their ontology. Some of the transcendental, as maybe we'll talk about in just a bit, especially with the Industrial Revolution, how that impacts ontology. I think we're fighting against some of the abuses, but Rousseauianism will have its day in postmodernism, which is the clapback a lot of ways to the modernistic ontology of humanity and saying, no, humans are individuals and humans are good, which is something that, generally speaking, modernism was not in favor of. I hope that's accurate. I know I'm painting really broad brushes and generalizing a lot of philosophers in a short period of time, but I think generally that's pretty accurate.
So I'm going to say, I think it's a lot more complex. Caleb and I were talking about this before. So, for instance, the noble savage image is the idea that man in nature, man unmolested by civilization, societal structures, is most perfect. So you end up, and this still is a mythology we live with today, that tribes that have not come in contact with modernity are going to be more noble, more peaceful, more whatever, characteristic you want to throw.
Utopic. Yep.
Right. And then you've got sort of Mel Gibson's Apocalypto, which just completely jettisons that notion. Says, no, they're sacrificing each other. They're sun gods, that this is a brutal place to live. And it was. I mean, it was distinctly brutal. And so there is, I think, this constant undertone. While I think society moved on with the Lockean approach that man needs the restraint of governance, there's always this underlying optimism that if we could just get all the structures out of the way, man would be good. And if we could just get back to nature. So this is a lot of your literature and movies and so forth early on have this constant notion, and still today have this constant notion that if we could get rid of all the rules, that man in his state of nature is going to be good. Now, that's wrestling with all sorts of notions. One author, I read a book called Born Bad, and it basically took the idea of original sin from Augustine on, kind of traced that through history. And his proposition is that as the Enlightenment came along and was sort of pushing back against those traditional notions of the inherited sin, it really just replaced it with Darwinism, a different kind of inherited sin, that man is brutal and so forth because he comes from animals. But there's another interpretation of that, which is sort of Freudian, that says that if we just give in to those animal instincts, we'd be better off, right? That we would be more natural and less repressed and all of this. So it's kind of a tension, I would say, more of that has continued with this sort of, on the one hand, men are basically good, and on the other hand, men are basically evil. And I think the reality, even for us, is difficult because it's not one camp or the other. As Chesterton notes in Orthodoxy, look around. The fact that men are sinful is an obvious truth. Yeah. That we can look around and make the observation that men are sinful, and this is a true thing to say, that we are a sinful race. But the corollary is not then that we have no choice but to sin. Right. And that is the other extreme, is that we are sinful, and Darwin and Augustine would both leave you with the impression that we have no choice about that. I think the truth is, the ontological truth is that we are created good, but that we universally run away from that, and with an obvious tendency to do that, but not with without an inability to do good, but rather with a constant pattern of not doing good.
Yeah, the only slight adjustment I would say on that, and I don't mean to be pedantic here, but I think we're created to be good. We aren't inherently created good.
Fair.
But in the potential to do good, and this goes back to free will, right, is there's also the inherent potential to do evil if we truly have free will. And free will discussions are tied into ontology, who we are, what our being is. Going back real quick to Stephen's, your point there on like the Rousseauian view and how that's present today, that is all around us, this battle of good versus evil on terms of our ontology. And we don't frame it, like nobody puts up a sign and be like, ontological discussions here, like that's not how it's going to be. But here in Puerto Rico, for example, and in the entire West, Christopher Columbus Day, that's celebrated in October, is super controversial because people here in Puerto Rico, the Taino people were here before Columbus came. And some people want to be like, oh, the Tainos were just great. Everything was kumbaya and they're, it's perfect. And then Columbus came, civilization came, and it just oppressed everybody. That's not the most accurate picture. Were there problems? Are there problems with civilization? Yes. And guess what? The Bible presents problems with civilization, whether it's Egypt or Babel in Genesis 11, Babylon later on, all the way, through Persia, Greece, Rome, etc. There are problems. What was that?
Or Israel.
Or Israel, yeah. Even the theocratic state that God created to be the example there are always problems. And so, but does that mean that humanity is better without civilization? Well, this is where the book of Judges comes back in and is like, no. You think just anarchy would be fantastic. It's not. It's terrifying. And so Romans 13's view, right, of God instituting governments for order, and same with 1 Peter 2, is something that we have to take into consideration. But oftentimes people would then extrapolate the existence or order of civilization or a lack thereof to the ontology of man. And the reality, as Stephen is expressing, is we are created with the potential to do good, and we're created with the potential to do evil. Sadly, we tend to evil because of our selfishness. But those issues, right, continue on to this day. I do think, generally speaking, most modernistic endeavors were going to focus more on the inherent nature of man, evil of man. But also that was more popular because most everybody was either Catholic or Protestant, and both sides of Catholicism and Protestantism believed in the inherent evil, hereditary evil of man. And so Rousseau was way before his time. But that thought in and of itself that humans are just inherently good, as we will see as we investigate, hopefully, Lord willing, in future conversations, has some really bad consequences. But pivoting a little bit from this idea of humans being maybe evil and need to be controlled and governed, then when the materialistic influence came in, now humans can be manipulated. They can be used. They can just be as chattel. There are cogs in a machine, and especially with the tech. There's two industrial revolutions. One that takes place the late 1700s into the early 1800s, and then the second industrial revolution in the mid to later 1800s. And in both of these situations, there are huge advancements in technology, huge advancements in production. But what ends up happening? Humans become just subject to machines, and they become facilitators to machines that are then going to produce, and humans become consumers. So they're part of an ecosystem. They're not God-filled spirit or spirit-filled beings made in the image of God that are worthy of dignity, that are worthy of respect and honor, and that should be going out and showing having dominion. Now they're just cogs that we can replace in a machine. And if someone dies, oh well, we have somebody else to replace them. And that kind of inhumanity that came from that just very rugged economic materialistic ontology, that's what was pushed back against by men like Ralph Waldo Emerson, David Thoreau, and others in more of the romantic transcendentalists, because they were realizing we're losing. You'll hear this even today, people saying we're losing our humanity. What do they mean by that? They're saying what we've done, especially with technology, and I don't want to get all into like just technology here, because technology is not unique just to modernism, but there's something there, and there was especially something historically in modernity that was just degrading and was really eating away at the ontology that people knew. And this becomes very evident in the 20th century when you see other political systems, whether socialism or communism, are rising, and the terrible wars that took place in the 20th century, that there was no respect for human life. And even today, as Stevens mentioned, with the prevalence of abortion, the just reduction of human ontology has been absolutely devastating on history in the last 200 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that I've referenced hard times several times in these talks. There's a scene in that book where there's a conversation between Sissy Jupe, who is this one of the main characters, and the daughter of the school teacher. And Sissy is telling Louisa, the daughter of the school teacher, how she gets everything wrong. And she says, well, like, what do you mean? Louisa asks, what do you mean? And so Sissy says, well, for instance, I was asked about, that if there are this many million people in a town and only this many people die of accidents in the mills every year, then, wouldn't you say that's a good statistic? And her response was, well, I don't think the people who are the families of those people would care about the statistics.
Right.
And it wouldn't be very good to them. And so this was the sort of this is Dickens wrestling with what we're talking about, that what you have in that sort of mechanistic, as they're going through the Industrial Revolution, is that men, in addition to all the machines, men are becoming parts of those machines. Mm-hmm. And the failure of those men, the deaths of those men, are being looked at like so many machine parts. And yeah, you're going to have breakdowns, and look, it's statistics, right? And here is Sissy Jupe coming in and going, those are still people. And of course, there are people that love them, and that's going to be devastating to them. Whatever the numbers are, that's going to hurt. And I think that's the sort of thing that it's easy in our modern ontology to forget about the importance of the human in our modern society, that it's easy to just think in terms of big numbers and statistics and the numbers of people. And let me just be honest, on the flip side of that, I don't think that all policies, all actions and policies should hinge on the life or death of a single person, but that the life or death of a single person should be given its due weight and understanding. In other words, I don't think somebody should say, don't go to war because someone might die, but rather ask the question, is this worth dying for?
Right. Exactly.
Because there are things worth dying for,
Mm-hmm.
but that death ought to be considered with its ontological weight of a human life has been lost.
Amen.
And so,
not just the material benefit, productivity,
right.
economic benefit that's there, and that sadly, in a lot of ways, the scientific development in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, or political advancements, or technological advancements, it's always really frontlined a lot of those other issues rather than considering it. And Stephen's absolutely right. There are certain things that are worth the sacrifice of
Yes.
human life. But the answer to that is not, oh, well, we're just going to operate without any factor or consideration of human ontology. Because if that happens, we shouldn't be surprised when humans turn into animals, when they turn into just material existence. And that's what happens. The meaning crisis, the crisis of identity, all of this is not an accident. All of these things are products, consequences of decisions that are made. And ontology and the idea here affects the projects we undertake as a society. It affects the structure and the organization of our cities. It affects the design of our buildings, the way we consider, as Stephen mentioned, art. All of these things, whether it's architecture, whether it's direction of business, or organizational patterns in terms of the way we live and how our neighborhoods are structured, all of these have to do with ontology. And sadly, many of the times, if we don't, or most of the time in the last, especially 100, 150 years, we haven't had a clear sense of ontology or ontological idea that's connected with teleology or cosmology. And we've just been floating around on this. And it's something, too, as we've talked about with identity, that ought to be firm. And I was just thinking some of the things, as Stephen was describing this earlier on, from the creational idea of an ontology. This is present in Genesis 1, the very first page of the Bible. Cosmology, God creates everything. And then what? Boom, ontology. He creates man according to his image, and then gives man responsibilities and purpose, and lets man categorize, and has all of that is just in the first couple chapters. And then obviously it gets more complicated and expands in a lot of ways, both in terms of cosmology and ontology. But it's right there. And yet many times we just go through assuming that we all know what we're talking about, or, oh, it's obvious. And we haven't really broken these things down. And it's interesting because I think, especially in view of what we've talked about with the Industrial Revolution, I think some Christians, and myself as well, we kind of feel split sometimes. It's like, well, this work or this action provides me such a benefit, but it's also dehumanizing. And it's like, well, it's worth it. And I remember hearing a lecture back when I was in college of somebody talking about city planning. And they're talking about how city planning is just all revolves around vehicles. And that's not an accident. But that when we are in vehicles, we do not see each other's humanity. We just see an obstacle in our path. And I've thought about that, and even in recent times, as I sometimes get frustrated in a traffic jam, or if someone's sitting in an intersection not moving, I get angry. But if that was just a human being and we were walking by each other, I wouldn't be angry at that person at all. And so there's ways that ontology even affects our perception and our self-conception and our perception of other people. And we have to be cautious of that, because generally speaking, the modernistic approach towards a mechanization of all things leads to a dehumanizing treatment of ourselves and others. And then the other thing with ontology is that if we have problems, right, what is the solution to that problem? If I have an ontological problem of sickness or hunger or whatever the case may be, science is going to say, hey, we are your solution. And we're going to obviously talk more about the the solution part tied to ontology with teleology, because that's like, what's the purpose? What's the trajectory that we're going to? But with human beings, what is our ontological problem? Most people think, well, it's just in terms of material reality or Maslow's hierarchy of needs or comfort or security or whatever the case may be. That's not true. That's not our fundamental problem. And even if you provide all those physical materialistic things, human beings still have problems.
Mm-hmm.
And the modernistic, materialistic, cosmological, and ontological visions, or even if it's a naturalistic evolutionary vision that's similar to that cosmology or ontology, they don't have answers to that, because they will promote this sense of material progress. But when material progress is arrived at, there's no answer. They don't even want to admit that there are ontological problems, because to admit a different ontology and to admit ontological problems and that they don't have the solutions is going to completely destroy their system. And so something that I've been hitting on, whether talking about the switch to digital movements and how that's affected ontology, or kind of the course of materialistic cosmology and ontology kind of running out of gas in terms of what they can promise and what they can fulfill. We're on the precipice of change, significant philosophical and societal change. And most of us, I think, can feel that already. We can feel the ontology of change, but we're struggling somewhat to identify it. And I think a big argument from both Stephen and I is that our failure to recognize the history of these religious and philosophical problems has left us completely unmoored and unprepared to face any of the changes, whether they be positive changes or perhaps disastrous changes, that are awaiting us at this change. And I don't have a sense of progress or a lot of hope, because sadly, there's still a grasping to this materialistic ontology, whether it's with abortion, whether with education or AI, fill in the blank. There's a big problem with people still grasping onto those old senses of materialistic or kind of like a depraved sense of ontology, but they're not wanting to go through with the full force of it, even though the power of that in terms of its historical and cultural moment is kind of rapidly.
It's wanting the ontology to remain nebulous instead of rooting it in something eternally real, eternally existent, right? So I think about that, going back to the gender. I think some of the ways in which more conservative people or even liberal people who are sounding conservative are pushing back is with, it's like pushing back with a materialistic ontology that's just going to take us back, a generation.
Yeah.
And then root us back into that ontology, rather than saying, no, that there is a perfect image that God wants us to look at in that ontology, a perfect idea of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a human. And unless we root ourselves back into that, we're going to keep ending up, whether it's about people or about other things and ideas and institutions, marriage, government, whatever, as long as we keep looking at those things as if they have nebulous ontology that can be different, infinitely different, infinitely unique for every person, then we're going to end up back in this fractured place of unmoored ontology.
Yeah.
And everybody it's all your opinion. It's my opinion. It's your opinion. What does this mean? What is it? Well, it just depends on whatever you think it means. And we're going to end up back with these definitions that are circular and nonsense. Like a woman is anybody that says they're a woman, which doesn't
right.
mean.
And I think this is where there's a particular generational shift in this as well, because I see, especially with Gen Z and even some of the older now Gen Alphas, they're looking at this and they're like, that's ridiculous. You can't just claim to change your ontology from one day to another. And they see the ridiculousness of either and the limitations of a materialistic ontology or a digital ontology, completely untethered. They are like, those are ridiculous. But at the same time, they don't want to go back to Christianity. Like, and so they're stuck because they're like, we don't like what we got and what we've inherited, and it doesn't work. It's ridiculous. We should be able to see that. But the only other option is an option that is beyond the pale for us. We do not want to go back to Christianity. Well, actually, some of them now are,
Yeah.
which is why we see, I think part of the reason why we see this uptick in this renewed vigor of conservative ideals and even religious ideals. People are talking about how there's massive amounts of young people moving to Catholicism, moving to Greek Orthodoxy, and even other conservative forms of Protestantism. Why? Because they see that system is just dying and dead. It doesn't even make any sense. And so they're naturally going to the only system that's available. Now, sadly,
And the perceived oldest versions of that.
Yes. But this goes to your point, Stephen, is if those movements, right, really don't have a biblical ontology, but are just trying to roll back the clock 500 years, whether it's Catholicism or Reformation or whatever the case may be of the movement, we're going to just reiterate the whole line. And what we'll see is like, yeah, the trappings will be different and the pitfalls may look a little different, but we'll just see a repetition of the last like 300 years or 200 years of history go forward, which would be terrible. But that's what some people believe just happens, is that there's these cycles that a cosmology ontology is proposed. It runs its course and kind of runs out of steam. An alternative one is proposed, and really it's not a different one. It's just an earlier iteration or version, and then it just falls back into the same thing.
That's right.
I hope that's not the case. God,
Yeah.
I think when you talk about ontology from the biblical point of view, it's like returning to Christ. Christ is the perfect form of ontology.
Yeah, that's it. He's the Adam.
Yep.
He's the new Adam.
And if we'll return to him, then we don't have to be stuck in these back and forth cycles of, oh, is man inherently evil, or is man inherently good, or is man just a machine, or is man like, we don't have to go into that. We can have a very rooted and eternal form of an ontology that is built then to prosper and to flourish and to have prosperity, not in necessarily a material form, but spiritual prosperity and a proper dominion over the cosmos with a participatory nature with God. But in order to do that, we have to have a fundamental shift in terms of that. And it's very difficult, I think, for people to grasp that, because Gen Z and Gen Alpha don't want to accept the Christian form of ontology. Why? Because it comes with responsibility and it comes with the teleology, as we're going to hopefully talk about in the next conversation. And I think people anticipate that. It's like they want the Christian ontology, and like even human rights, right, is built. Everyone wants human rights. And it's like, where are these human rights that the materialists speak of? Like, where do they exist materially? Oh, they don't. And same with the nominalists. Every nominalist wants these rights, but they don't exist. And so it's like, okay, people want Christian ontology, but they're not willing to really start there, because they're looking down the line and say, I don't want that limitation. I don't want that. I don't want that. I want what I want. And it's like, oh, individualism and kind of libertarianism is incommensurate and irreconcilable with biblical ontology. And then it's just like, oh no.
Yeah. I want the anchor of Christianity without any of the demands. Yeah. And so that's well, I do think teleology, as we bring this to a close, we'll see in our next episode how this really just flows into that discussion, because the thing that defines our existence is critical as an aspect of defining what our purpose is, or what our goals and our ends are. And so we'll talk more about that next episode. I hope this has been a helpful discussion and sort of seeing what the problem is. Again, we're not getting to solutions yet. I know.
And if I could just interject one thing real quick here, Stephen, I know we oftentimes are using the philosophical words like epistemology, cosmology, ontology, teleology. But if someone's thinking about a system or even a movie or a book or an article, just ask yourself, what system is this person talking about? How do they think? How are they projecting or saying that I can know things? What are they saying that the universe and the world is made up and organized as? Who do they say that I am in this system? Whether it's system of government or even the movie or wherever, who am I supposed to be and what qualities do I have? And then teleologists will discuss what direction, what destiny, what purpose is this bringing me to? If you just have those basic questions in your mind, you can start to think critically about these things and hopefully biblically, right? And begin to evaluate. You don't need to memorize all the philosophic names and that kind of stuff. Just ask the basic questions. How do I know? What is the system organized as? Where am I in the system? Who am I in this system? And where am I headed? And if you get to the point, you're like, wait a second, the system is saying that I'm just a bunch of atoms. That's it. Or I'm just a bag of flesh and I have no organization, no purpose, no direction, no nothing. Then that can be a very good sign that, like, okay, it's not teaching me the proper biblical ontology or the proper biblical cosmology. So think about these things in practice, and hopefully the terms and discussions are helpful, but don't get lost in them in terms of trying to put these things into practice and analysis, I guess, in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's shorthand. The reason people have come up with these terms is not to be obscure or to use jargon. It's just a single word that refers to a concept that would be a mouthful if we said it in full. So that's right. The only reason we use the terminology. So we'll plan on teleology in our next discussion, and then we'll be moving into what are some solutions. We'll talk a little bit more about some philosophical underpinnings, and then try to get to eventually what are the solutions. I know we've been hinting at it.
Yeah, so we're also gonna have to talk about how we want to go about that. Do we want to take a break and talk about solutions to modernism, or do we want to jump into the younger sibling of modernism and high modernity and post-modernity and kind of evaluate all that? So we got some planning to do on that, but I'm looking forward to it. It's a lot of good material to cover.
Yeah, likewise. All right, Caleb, appreciate it, and we'll look forward to next time.
Always a pleasure. God bless.
Likewise.